Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. The fall of Tony Ferguson has been one of the most tragic stories in MMA over the past couple years, and it goes to show you how fast MMA moves and how fast somebody can fall from grace in the sport. And I wanted to make a video about the downfall of Tony Ferguson and where he can go from here. What's next for Tony Ferguson? But I felt like it was so depressing that I wanted to talk about the rise of Tony Ferguson as well. So this is going to be the rise and fall of Tony Ferguson. I want to discuss the good parts of his career because there's a lot of new fans who have started watching since 2020 and all they have ever known is Tony Ferguson losing. And that is really upsetting to me. So in this video, we're going to talk about the rise and fall of Tony Ferguson. We're going to talk about what's next for Tony Ferguson. And we're going to talk about a massive fear that I have for Tony Ferguson post UFC or post MMA career in general. But if you go all the way back to 2008, that is when Tony Ferguson began fighting pro in MMA. He went 10-2 in his initial 12 fights before he ended up getting an opportunity to fight on The Ultimate Fighter. The season was Brock Lesnar versus Junior Dos Santos back in 2011. And on The Ultimate Fighter, he went 3-0, all three finishes, and he makes his way to the Ultimate Fighter finale. And back then, I know it doesn't seem like much now, but back then, being the Ultimate Fighter actually meant something. And he goes on to fight Ramsey Ninjum in the Ultimate Fighter finale back on June 4th of 2011, and he finishes Ramsey Ninjum via first round KO. And then after that, he wins 2 straight fights, and then he suffers his first loss in the UFC against Michael Johnson, loses via decision. Now, after this decision loss to Michael Johnson, he goes on an absolute tear, a 12-fight winning streak, which is crazy because, I mean, to go on a 12-fight winning streak is insane, but to go on it in the lightweight division, arguably the most stacked division in the UFC, especially over the course of those years, he went undefeated from 2013 all the way up until he fought Justin Gaethje in 2020. But let's talk about some notable fights in that 12-fight run. He destroyed Josh Thompson. He won via decision, but absolutely destroyed him in that fight. He beat Edson Barboza. Prime Edson Barboza just put so much pressure on him, beat him up, eventually got a Darce choke. He fought Lando Venata on short notice, and Lando Venata actually hurt him badly multiple times in this fight, but Tony Ferguson came back, was able to survive, and finish him via Darce choke. And then, in my opinion, probably the most impressive win of Tony Ferguson's career was when he beat Rafael Dos Anjos back in November of 2016. What a performance this was. And Rafael Dos Anjos, I know he's still fighting now, and he's not necessarily the elite of the elite. Back in 2016, Rafael Dos Anjos, the elite of the elite, and Tony Ferguson went out there and looked so good in that fight. He won via decision, but he looked so good in that matchup. And then he gets an interim lightweight title fight against Kevin Lee at UFC 216 in October of 2017. And what was going on at this point in time is Conor McGregor had won the belt against Eddie Alvarez back in 2016. And essentially he was holding it hostage, and Dana White and the UFC didn't want to necessarily strip him of it, but they didn't know what they wanted to do with the lightweight division. So they said, let's book Tony Ferguson and Kevin Lee for an interim lightweight title fight. The winner will fight Conor McGregor if he returns. And people forget this fight because Tony went out there and ended up submitting Kevin Lee via triangle choke in the 3rd round. But they forget Kevin Lee early in this fight was dominating Tony Ferguson. In the first round, the first half of the first round was competitive. But then the second half of the first round, Kevin Lee was able to get Tony Ferguson down and just dominate him on the ground. At the end of the round, he basically had Tony completely mounted and was just raining down nasty ground and pound shots. But then in the second round, after the fight was stopped, you go into the second round, Kevin Lee started to slow down. And then the second round was much more competitive, similar to the first half of the first round. And then in the 3rd round, you could really see that Kevin Lee was getting exhausted. And Tony Ferguson's biggest strength was his cardio and his volume and his pressure. And he starts putting the pressure on Kevin Lee. Kevin Lee shoots in on a takedown, gets Tony down with ease, but then Tony's just looking for submissions, almost gets an armbar. He's just ripping elbows from the bottom as well, and then eventually finds a triangle choke on an exhausted Kevin Lee in the 3rd round, and Tony Ferguson becomes the interim lightweight champ. What's crazy to me about this moment in time was Tony should have gone down in history as an undisputed lightweight champion, but because Conor McGregor was holding up the lightweight division, that will never be true now. And what's crazy is his next fight was scheduled, Tony Ferguson's next fight was scheduled for April of the following year, April of 2018 at UFC 223. He was supposed to take on Khabib Nurmagomedov. Conor was still the champion at the time, and Dana White was being very vague about what was going to happen. And he was saying, this is for the real belt. But then when he asked on updates, is Conor stripped? Has he vacated? He was kind of really vague on that. And eventually what ended up happening, it ended up being for the undisputed belt. They ended up stripping Conor McGregor. But it ended up being like announced like the week of the fight, or even it might have been even after the fight, honestly. You ended up having Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Al Iaquinta. Now, the reason you ended up with Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Al Iaquinta is because the week of the fight, this is crazy, the week of the fight, Tony Ferguson in a hotel lobby trips over a cord and blows out his knee. Blows out his knee, has to pull out of the fight. And it's crazy how many times, we're going to talk about it in a minute, how many times Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov was canceled. But talk about bad luck. And it was announced. It was literally announced on April Fool's Day. They said Tony Ferguson out of the fight with Khabib Nurmagomedov, Max Holloway stepping in. I flat out refused to believe it. I said, there's no way this is true. I'm not believing it. Dana White's pulling a gag on us. I don't believe it. I woke up on April 2nd and I'm like, okay, joke's over, guys. Joke's over. And there was no joke. Now, Max Holloway ended up having issues making weight or something with his medicals. And that fight didn't come to fruition, so they had Al Iaquinta on the card. They let Al Iaquinta step in. So you had Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Al Iaquinta for the undisputed title. Khabib Nurmagomedov goes on to win. And we're going to talk about what went on with Tony and Khabib in a little bit, but let's go on to Tony's next fights. Because Tony's next fight after blowing out his knee in April of 2018 is in October of 2018 against Anthony Pettis at UFC 229. And this was a great performance from Tony Ferguson. This was vintage Tony Ferguson. You know, he ate some shots in this fight, but he was just walking down Anthony Pettis and making him quit in this fight. Eventually gets a TKO due to, not doctor stoppage, due to corner stoppage in the second round because Tony was really just beating up Pettis. I think Pettis said he had a broken hand or something. They ended up stopping the fight, but Tony was really starting to come on strong in that second round. And I think this is one of the most tragic fights of Tony Ferguson's career. And I know you're probably thinking, well, why? He got a win. He looked like vintage Tony Ferguson in this fight. Because guess what the main event of UFC 229 was? It was Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor. To have, at that period of time, to have Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov on the same event, fighting on the same card, and they both make it. Neither one of them ends up pulling out of their fights. And to see them not fight each other is crazy, especially back in 2018. And we're going to talk about that saga in a minute. But then Tony goes on in his next fight in June of 2019 to beat the brakes off of Donald Cerrone. Beat him up badly, busted up his eye. I think Donald Cerrone ended up like blowing his nose. His eye, swelling of his eye just blew up, completely couldn't see. It ends up getting stopped by the doctor. And then that's when Tony Ferguson starts to have his fall off. Now, before we get into his fall off, I want to talk about the Khabib Nurmagomedov saga. And I'm going to discuss who I think would have won a fight when they were both in their prime. So first off, this is crazy to me. And a lot of people may not even know this. Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov was scheduled 5 separate times. You go all the way back to 2015 was when they were first initially scheduled to fight. Khabib pulled out with a rib injury. Then you go to 2016. Tony Ferguson pulled out. I think it had to do with medicals or something along those lines. It doesn't say here. It says Ferguson injury. Then you get to 2017. This was supposed to be on UFC 209. And Khabib Nurmagomedov ends up having issues with his weight cut. This is literally like the day of or the day before the fight. Khabib Nurmagomedov pulls out. And then 2018, Tony trips on the cable, tears his ACL, is out for a while. Last minute scramble, the whole April Fool's debacle. And then the last fight between the two that were canceled, unbelievable. In 2020, it was scheduled for April of 2020. And I'll never forget, in March of 2020, there was a press conference, and I believe it was Mark Raimondi asked a question. I think it was the press conference for Nurmagomedov versus Ferguson. I think that's the one when Ferguson showed up with the baseball. And Mark Raimondi asked, this virus is going around the world. We didn't know nothing at the time what was to come. Could this have any effect on the fight? And he got booed out of the building, and Dana basically told him, no way, shut up. And unfortunately, because of what happened in 2020, the virus, Khabib was stuck in Russia, couldn't get over to the United States, and we got Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson canceled for a 5th time. And then obviously it never happens because Tony goes on to fight Justin Gaethje for the interim title because Khabib is the undisputed champion after beating Al Iaquinta. Now, what would have happened if Tony Ferguson ever fought Khabib Nurmagomedov? Now, I understand there is recency bias because of the fall off of Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson, back in his prime, was literally the lightweight boogeyman. He had a very unique set of skills where it was pressure, volume, and just nonstop putting his pace on other guys. And what would happen is he would make up for some of his skill differentials by being able just to break guys. Tony Ferguson was the king of breaking guys. And Tony Ferguson, what made the fight against Khabib so interesting was Tony would never accept a position. I'll never forget. You go back, I believe it was UFC 177. Tony fought Danny Castillo, and he won via split decision. And in this fight, Tony was taken down. I haven't watched this fight super recently, but I believe he was taken down in all 3 rounds and controlled for a good period of time in all 3 rounds. Well, how did he win the split decision? He was constantly trying to scramble. He was constantly throwing up submissions, and he was constantly throwing elbows from the bottom. This was a controversial decision at the time, but I thought the judges got it right. I thought Tony Ferguson, should have won that fight, even though he was laying on his back for almost the entire fight. Now, against Khabib Nurmagomedov, we know what Khabib would have tried to do. Khabib would have tried to take him down, beat him up, ground and pound him. And even when Tony Ferguson was in his prime, my belief on a potential Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson fight was unfortunately that Tony Ferguson would get absolutely wrecked by Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib was just a stylistic nightmare for Tony Ferguson because Khabib had elite level jiu-jitsu, elite level submission skills, elite level submission defense, and Tony was just going to end up on the bottom throwing elbows and looking for submissions, and it wasn't going to work against a guy like Khabib Nurmagomedov. So even though I am depressed that fight never happened, I'm at peace with it because I feel like I already know what would have happened. And I think Khabib Nurmagomedov would have gotten a finish, whether it be submission or whether it be ground and pound finish, TKO. But it's still a fight that it is kind of unfortunate. You had all these opportunities for this fight to happen on their come up, at a point it was like a number 1 contender fight. And then it was for the undisputed championship. And the fact that all these different things would happen, and this fight just wasn't meant to be. A fight cancellation 5 times is crazy, and then the 2020 fight cancellation was just straight up insanity. I mean, who would have thought that was going to happen? I mean, the world did not want Nurmagomedov versus Ferguson. So what happened after that 2020 fight was canceled against Nurmagomedov? This is when you start to get to the fall of Tony Ferguson, and I'm so depressed even talking about it. Because Tony in his prime, he was so good. He was so good. His striking skills weren't necessarily the greatest. His grappling skills weren't necessarily the greatest. But they were all good enough. And then the pressure and pace to just break guys was so beautiful to watch. Now, he ends up taking a short notice fight with Justin Gaethje. Now, don't get me wrong. He was in training camp. He was scheduled to fight in April. They ended up having the Justin Gaethje fight at UFC 249 in May of 2020. Now, this is still a short notice fight because you have Tony Ferguson going from fighting Khabib Nurmagomedov to now he's fighting Justin Gaethje, a completely different stylistic matchup. And most people were picking Tony Ferguson going into this fight. And this was going to be, again, for the interim lightweight title. I just hate that Tony was never an undisputed lightweight champion because Conor was holding the belt hostage while he sat on the sideline for 2 years because that Kevin Lee fight should have been for an undisputed title. But he gets a short notice fight against Justin Gaethje at UFC 249. Most people thought that Tony Ferguson would win this fight. I thought Justin Gaethje was a nightmare matchup for Tony just because he had decent wrestling. It's not like Tony was going to go out there and take him down. Justin Gaethje had really good power and really good striking. And Justin Gaethje went out there. The first round was competitive. Tony Ferguson actually dropped Justin Gaethje at the bell with an uppercut. And Justin Gaethje just beats the brakes off of Tony for 5 long rounds. There was so much damage done. I mean, think about it. 5 rounds, and Justin Gaethje dominated 4 of those rounds for the most part. There were early rounds that were competitive, but there was a lot of damage dished out by Justin Gaethje in this fight. And think about how powerful Justin Gaethje is. And Tony ends up getting hit with a big shot in the 5th round and basically quits. I don't even want to say that, but he took so much damage, he backed up and kind of shook his head. And then the referee had just seen enough. They seen enough accumulation. It wasn't your typical TKO, but the ref made the right call, stopping it in the 5th round. Well, we're like, okay, well, we'll see what happens with Tony when he returns. He's still he's only 1 or 2 fights away from potentially fighting for the title. His next fight is in December of that year, and he fights Charles Oliveira. Now, again, even though I was a big fan of Tony and I thought Tony was an elite level fighter, I seen some of these matchups and I'm like, this is not a good matchup for him. And I picked Charles Oliveira in this fight. And Charles Oliveira, sure enough, went out there and out-grappled him for 3 rounds, beat him up for 3 rounds, had a nasty armbar at one point that he tucked under his armpit. Tony just refused to tap. Charles Oliveira wins, 30-27 decision. It might have even been like a 30-26. I don't remember the scorecards. Then his next fight, he gets booked against Beneil Dariush. Now, I actually thought, okay, this is going to be a competitive fight, but I think Tony Ferguson should win this fight. And Beneil Dariush went out there and out-grappled him for pretty much the majority of the fight. Had a knee bar at one point, or a heel hook. I can't remember exactly what it was. Tony just said, you know what, I'm just going to grit through it. Doesn't tap out, ends up losing a dominant decision loss to Beneil Dariush. And then he gets rebooked a year later against Michael Chandler at UFC 274. And I said, look, Tony's been losing, but he's been fighting all these grapplers, and he's been fighting all these people who prioritize the takedown. Michael Chandler's very hittable, and also he fights in a style that's not conducive to, grappling. Even though Michael Chandler has good wrestling, he doesn't use it. I thought Tony's going to beat Michael Chandler. I got a lot of crap for that, picking Tony Ferguson in that fight. And Tony looked so good in the first round. It was almost, for a second, you were like seeing vintage Tony even drop Michael Chandler, and he was landing good shots. Then the end of the first round, he gets taken down, beaten up a little bit at the end of the first round. But I thought, oh, Tony's got this in the bag because Chandler's going to start to fade. Second round, early in the second round, Michael Chandler just punts Tony Ferguson's head off, brutally KOs him, sleeps him badly. And then I'm like, okay, this might be the end of Tony. Now he's on a 4-fight losing streak. And then the UFC did him a massive disservice in his next fight. At UFC 279, he was scheduled to fight Li Jingliang. And what people forget about this is this card wasn't, put together for months, months in advance. This was one of those cards similar to what's going on with UFC 293 now, where they didn't have the fights on the card. The card was basically barren a couple weeks before the fight card. And Dana was like, oh, we're working on some things. So the UFC announced Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang literally like 3 weeks out from the card. And then eventually you have the debacle like 2 days before where Khamzat's not going to make weight. And then the weigh-in day, everyone's freaking out. And the UFC reshuffles the entire card. And you get Tony Ferguson versus Nate Diaz as the main event. And I thought, okay. I thought Li Jingliang was going to absolutely brutally KO Tony. So I'm like, all right, the Nate Diaz fight, I think Tony can win this fight. Tony looked like a shell of himself out there. He looked horrible. And I know he went up a weight class to 170, and I know he was on short notice, but he looked horrible in this fight. He looked slow, and it was competitive, but then eventually he gets submitted in the 4th round, shoots in on a takedown, gets guillotined. Tony in his prime would have destroyed Nate Diaz, even Nate Diaz in his prime. And then, most recently, you have the fight against Bobby Green at UFC 291 just a couple weeks ago. And, man, Tony looked okay early. Then he gets eye-poked, and then it just goes downhill from there. Bobby Green's just lighting him up. And then eventually, Bobby Green finishes him in the 3rd round via arm triangle. And now Tony's on a 6-fight losing streak. Talk about depressing. To go from a 12-fight winning streak to now a 6-fight losing streak is just absolute insanity. And Tony is now 15-7 in the UFC. Think about that. Before 2020, he was 15-1 in the UFC. What an amazing record that is, especially when you're fighting some of the top guys. Now, Tony, he's not going to retire, guys. I don't think he's going to retire. He's come out already and said, I got eye poked and I was never the same after that. And he's already kind of making excuses. And I'm really worried about what Tony is going to do next because I don't want Tony to end up like Bigfoot Silva. For those of you who don't know, Bigfoot Silva is a heavyweight fighter who's basically been getting brutally KO'd since like 2012. I don't even know how long of a losing streak he's on now, but after his last fight, he was like, oh, I'm retiring, and then he already came back out of retirement. And I'm scared that's going to be Tony Ferguson's future. I'm really nervous about what happens next for Tony Ferguson. Because Tony Ferguson's style, it's not like his striking has regressed like crazy. It's not like his grappling has regressed like crazy. This was always Tony's style, and this was always Tony's skills. But it's just like Tony at now 50% because he's so much slower now because he's older. He's nowhere near as athletic. And a style of pressure and pace and basically just breaking your opponents with your pressure, pace, and cardio, it's not conducive to a long career. It's just not. It's not going to work for 10 years, and especially when you're 39 years old in the lightweight division. Maybe it could work at light heavyweight. Maybe it could work at heavyweight, which no guys at heavyweight really have any cardio. But it's not going to work at 39 years old in the lightweight division, and Tony has just slowed down. So his striking was never the elite of the elite. His grappling was never the elite of the elite. He had really good jiu-jitsu, but his main weapon was his volume and his pace. And without speed and without the cardio, as you know, he still has okay cardio, but it's nowhere near what it once used to be. It just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't. And he's taken so much damage. And I really think you can go back and pinpoint that moment in time back at UFC 249 where Justin Gaethje just wrecked him badly. He took so much damage. I really think that took years off of Tony's life, and I think that took years off of his career. And then I think the Michael Chandler KO really just finished Tony off and turned him into a dead body. And now that relieves the question, what's next for Tony? Because this is a really depressing situation. And honestly, there's not a whole lot of options for Tony right now because I don't know what he's going to do. Like, what career path could he possibly have? He's 39, which is old in fighting, but in life, he hasn't even lived half his life. He's basically halfway through his life. So he still has a whole nother half of life to live without MMA. And Tony's been around forever. He's been fighting in the UFC since 2011. What is he going to do next? And I don't know. Is the UFC going to cut him? I think they should. But is that what's best for Tony? Probably, but maybe not, because I have some fears, which we're going to talk about in a second. But honestly, if I could pick out an ideal scenario for Tony Ferguson, he goes and works at a gym somewhere as a coach, maybe a jiu-jitsu coach, some coaching, some MMA coaching somewhere along those lines. There's got to be an opening somewhere. He's got to have a friend somewhere who can get him in at a gym, and he can just, use his time to help coach other fighters. I think he would be a fine coach. And I think that's probably the best case scenario. The next best case scenario is maybe Tony just competes in jiu-jitsu. Maybe they can have Tony Ferguson on some of those UFC Fight Pass invitationals. I think that would be an ideal scenario, but I'll tell you what's not an ideal scenario. I don't want to watch Tony get beat up anymore in the UFC. I mean, imagine even like Paddy Pimblett, who's like bottom of the barrel UFC talent. I don't want to see them build Paddy Pimblett off the dead body of Tony Ferguson. I don't want to see that. Imagine the UFC might book Conor McGregor versus Tony Ferguson. Try to get Conor McGregor an easy win. I don't want to see that. And honestly, when you're looking at the lowest level of MMA in the lightweight division, or lowest level of the UFC in the lightweight division, I just can't even pinpoint a fight for Tony Ferguson that I think is winnable. If Tony would agree to one more fight and then he retires, if you could get him to agree to that, you book Tony Ferguson versus Jim Miller, UFC 300, two veterans of the sport, two legends of the sport. You book him for UFC 300. No matter what, he has to retire afterwards. I think if you could make that type of deal with him, I think that would be ideal. But I just don't know if Tony is ever going to want to stop fighting. This is all he knows. And his mentality and his overall mental health, I question and I worry about. If the UFC does cut him, what type of mental breakdown is he going to have? Imagine doing this as your career for your entire life, and then imagine one day it's just not there anymore. That is very depressing. That's tough to handle for anyone, let alone someone with Tony Ferguson, Tony Ferguson's mindset. Because Tony Ferguson, over the course of the last, 10 years, has shown he has mental health issues. So honestly, I wish the UFC can negotiate some type of off-ramp for Tony. We need some type of way to say, oh, look, we got this awesome job opening for you, Tony. We don't need you to fight anymore. You can do this, you can do that. You can be an ambassador for the sport, anything. The UFC needs to find a way to protect Tony Ferguson. They need to find a way to protect him. Because if you look over the past few years, really in particular, I think it was back in 2018 or 2019, Tony Ferguson has had some outbursts and some mental health issues. There was the issue where his wife at one point in time, who he's still with now, like applied for a restraining order, and Tony Ferguson was like unplugging his refrigerator because he said there was cameras in there, and he was saying there was people in the walls or cameras in the walls, and supposedly, this is all according to court documents from his wife, apparently he was like cutting wires on their AC units because he was saying, oh, you know, there's trackers in there, and there was weird things where he was basically abducting his son and running out into the rain with his son didn't even have clothes or shoes on, and there's all these different things that went on back in those, you know, back in 2018, 2019, and supposedly he's gotten together since then. But there's a history with Tony Ferguson and his mental health, and we haven't ever really had it confirmed. You know, not a lot of people have been wanting to pry. One reporter asked Tony about it at one point, and he basically told him to F off. And I think Tony Ferguson probably has schizophrenia. I think I've heard, you know, people suggest that before and seen it in some documents and stuff like that, but it's never really been officially confirmed. And obviously he's on some type of medication. Tony's always been a bit of an oddball, but I wonder if you take his career away from him, where does he go from there? You know, and you also have the incident from literally, what was it, a couple months, 6 months ago, maybe it was late last year, where Tony Ferguson's getting a DUI, you know, and obviously that case hasn't resolved yet. But Tony Ferguson, without his career, is a very scary prospect because I don't know what he's going to do if he doesn't have something to put his focus into. And my biggest fear with Tony Ferguson, and I don't know how to say this, but the best way to say it is I'm really scared of Tony Ferguson ending up like Chris Benoit. If you don't know who that is, that's a WWE superstar. Google him. You'll be able to understand. But with Tony's mental health, I really feel like the UFC needs to step up here and do something for Tony Ferguson. They need to help him figure it out. You know, these fighters, you know, their careers are so short and there's really no backup plan afterwards. If you don't make money like Conor McGregor or some of these other guys, and you don't set up, you know, these financial things for your post-fighting career, you're left in a horrible spot because you think Tony can go work a 9-to-5 job. I know he has a college education and this and that, but I just don't feel like Tony wants that. I don't feel like Tony's going to want to do that. Somebody has to help him. Obviously, his family's there, but I just hope the UFC steps in and maybe gives him like a Chuck Liddell job from years ago, you know, where they just basically give these guys jobs to basically be UFC ambassadors and travel to the events. But to be honest, I don't know what's going to happen, but I've been watching the sport since 2010. So I've been watching Tony Ferguson's entire UFC career. The rise and fall of Tony Ferguson has been one of the most depressing things I've ever seen. To go from a 12-fight winning streak to a 6-fight losing streak, and to be finished in 4 out of 6 of those, I just think it's super depressing, and I think Tony is already probably on the verge of a mental breakdown, and I worry what comes next. But I think the UFC has to cut him at this point. I think they have an obligation, but I hope they find a way to figure out how can they get Tony Ferguson into a different career path or help out with the UFC in general? Because he is a fan favorite fighter, so they could use him, you know, have him travel to events. I don't know if he can do like commentary. I don't think he will be able to do commentary. They have to find something for him. But overall, Tony Ferguson's career was so amazing to watch, you know, in the early days before the 2020 slide. I think, you know, to watch it from 2011 to 2019 was really a treat. He was one of my favorite fighters to watch. And the way he fought and the way he broke guys was really something to behold. And if you haven't seen Tony Ferguson's career when he was actually winning, I implore you to go back and check it out. It was something really to behold. But right now, I'm just praying to the MMA gods it all works out for Tony Ferguson. I don't want to see him go to another organization and get KO'd for another 10 years before eventually something actually happens with him, you know, from all the brain damage. I'm just praying for Tony Ferguson to have a good future, you know, outside of MMA or at least outside of fighting in the cage. And that's all we can really hope for. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.